Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Zaha, Hadid, architects. We've had 3 days of talk, so this is the last one. And it's quite a spicy topic because we're going to be asking, is beauty a dangerous word? This talks program is in partnership with Zaha Hadid, ERCO, Mixed Interiors, and we've had really great sessions for the past 3 days, and I'm sure this one will be no different. I will shortly introduce the panel, but before I do so, I'd like to get a bit of a straw poll from the audience and ask, which do you think is more important, form or function? So why don't we start with form? We have a couple of lone hands. Someone else is, I think, on the fence. Function. Okay, that feels pretty definitive. Let's see if any of you change your minds during the course of the next half an hour or so. But before we dive in, we're going to introduce the panel. So if you can please introduce yourselves and in just a line or two, answer the question, what does beauty mean to you?
Hi everyone, my name is Claire Hamill. I'm head of lighting at RDC in London. What does beauty mean to me? I think beauty wears many hats. And it has many different parameters, but for me, I had a beautiful coffee this morning. It tasted wonderful. It looked beautiful, but again, that's something that it is relative to my taste. I also think that for me, whenever I think of beautiful, I think of home. I think of Ireland. I think of these beautiful sunsets and rolling hills from the countryside of where I grew up and where I built up my visual values of what beauty is and what triggers my emotions. I think beauty is a very emotionally connected subject and obviously very personal to my lived experience and the environment that I grew up in and all the experiences I had as a lived human in the world that we live in today.
I'm also Northern Irish, so I agree with you on that. So I had a terrible hotel coffee this morning, so sadly, not so much. Ready?
Hi, I'm Denise Malcolm. I work at PT University. Beauty, very, very complicated, but also very simple, really. It's very personal, I agree. It's fairly subjective, but there are these theories and ideas that are universalizing out there, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a bit. But for me, it's personal, I think, and I think it's to who I am. I think I recognise something as beautiful I learn myself. Is absolutely was asking her.
Hello, my name's Justine Fox, and I'm a specialist. I'm a specialist in colour. I focus on the opportunities of colour beyond aesthetics, so how we can use it to promote identity and well-being, how we can provide sustainable practices. What does beauty mean to me? For me, it's not something that's abstract. As the other guests have said, I think it's something that is hardwired into us. And I feel that depending on how we feel in the day, so it's all tied into our experience, our feelings of what's beautiful today may shift to what we actually need around us tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm Patrick. I work here. First of all, I think the question was mostly positive. That's why I didn't raise a hand on either side, because you can't contrast upon function. You need form to deliver function. But what is good of us is what is more important, beauty or functionality. And then I have to say 100% functionality. But what is my idea of beauty here, what's important is beauty for me is a shortcut, intuitive recognition of the functional, and the rural history, we conditioned to recognize through superficial markers and keep appearance only what is good for us. There's a very deep kind of capacity of all organisms to distinguish, to work with attraction, repulsion, to distinguish the beneficial from the detrimental. That starts, but it still operates like this. And we are navigating the world, including the social world, necessarily through aesthetic valuations, through these kind of intuitive responses we couldn't do otherwise, because it's too complex. There are some moments when we step back and reflect we might want to criticize our reactions, our gut feelings, our investments and sensibilities. And that's why I think it's not good enough to say, I have my own idea of beauty, this is the thing that I love, but maybe you kind of put barriers in your own development by loving the wrong things. When you're nostalgic, where you kind of hook to false and irrelevant and attracted to all the wrong kind of people and institutions and places. So that's the historical element, I would say. And I want to say one more thing at the beginning. Is beauty a dangerous concept? Absolutely is. Incredibly dangerous. You can kind of, it's a career stopper if you, in the kind of current world of academia and schools of architecture and so on and so forth, not in the world of clients and the real world and end users. In the world of academic perfection, it's a career stopper, it's a dangerous thing. It's looked as being facile and superficial, and that is fundamentally the self-mutilation of that academic discipline. It kind of undermines itself by having that attitude. So I'm very grateful that we bring that concept to light, and we'll see what its underlying rationality is. I mean, I gave you a hint.
Fantastic. So, who decides what's beautiful? Penny, I know that you have some. It's a really deep question, but essentially, where do we agree? Where do we diverge? And who's the arbiter? And I know that there's actually a lot of this that is rooted in a history of tastemaking, I suppose.
Yes, I suppose if beauty is a quality of the artifact, the space, the exterior world, natural world, whatever, taste is what we bring to it as a kind of discrimination, way in which we make our decisions about what we like, what we don't like. So it's a slightly different thing, taste. It's in a different place. And taste making, there's a huge history of taste making, whether it's coming from a sort of aristocratic model, filtering down through society and affecting people right through, or more generally, as now, in a much more pluralistic, open-ended, global culture way. I think those are these taste cultures, which are groups of people. They might be small groups, it might be a family, it might be a street, they might be the world, but they create notions of purpose we share, those notions of purpose. And I think their identity forming, it is that sharing of the concept what brings people together, the small groups. But it's there.
Just a reminder to speak into the mic to make sure that everyone can hear you a bit. Just to do it. Justine, who gets to decide what is and isn't beautiful?
I really do think that it is down to the individual. You can look at all different areas of design and who does decide. If we speak to the masses and from a design perspective as designers, you only need to go into a retail outlet at the end of the season to see a rail completely full of perhaps one type of colour. The designers have thought it to be good taste, however, it's not resonated with the people, with the audience. And so that choice, that taste has to be inherent within.
No, it can't be left to an individual in this case. And nobody is deciding. And of course, we have shared aesthetic sensibility, like we have shared moral sensibilities and intuitions. And without that, we couldn't have a society which operates. Of course, so the collective decides, and it decides through a process of adaptation and learning. It's a collective, semi-conscious learning process, which of course has some layer of reflection, debate on top of that. That's where also things could go wrong. But I do find that the contemporary conditions, of course, there is these kind of for these learning processes to identify the beneficial versus detrimental. It still functions very well. If you have a very bad smell or tasting, you should stay away from it. It's probably still valid. But you can see how deep that is and how. But when it comes to identifying the environment or simply how somebody is dressing, then even kind of moral sensibility of somebody's behavior, whether you're kind of repulsed or attracted, that's where we have to. Some of us might have to update, and if these transformation of what works and doesn't work, it's really what works and doesn't work, and what signals a more vital and vibrant and productive environment, that you recognize it's through its appearances what you should be drawn to, and that becomes, because it's changing too fast, this kind of intuitive learning and then socializing, being socialized into, and being that potentially breaks down, and there's an enormous inertia, and that's why you need also sometimes an avant-garde, some people, let's say aesthetic revolutions which are pushed by individuals or also collectives, sort of avant-garde collectives, but and now you have the, for instance, modernism, the great heroes of modernism, they had to really revolutionize aesthetic sensibilities, but why? To break through and allow the wonders of industrial civilization and the new kind of society dynamics to be imprinting itself on the built environment, and the current up to that point sensibilities and valuations would have blocked that. So that's the complication. The other complication is, you say, there's different collectives, different societies, but also within society, division of labor, people have a little bit different life processes, environments, in the division of labor to some extent, how they're functioning. So there could be differences of what they should be liking and disliking. Although there's also something just universal, there is differentiation, and that makes it more complex. So I'm not saying there's an absolute universal set of aesthetic values, absolute, but there is a kind of, I think, should be convergence at the forefront of the most advanced and developed societies who are similar in the way as, let's say, the advanced knowledge economy and network society develop, this kind of what kind of environment and ways of behavior and kind of spaces you would these aesthetic sensibilities we should all kind of learn to love, so that we intuitively attuned with what works and what's vital.
Because Claire, beauty surely can't be so individualistic that it becomes therefore impossible to define or qualify, and especially working in design, developing products, there has to be areas in which there is consensus that, at least for the majority, we agree it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think from that perspective, there's lots of external factors that are continuously it's a continuous moving topic. It's continually evolving. Is it aesthetical? Is it something that drives feeling? Is it something that drives human experience and how we interact with spaces? Where does that value lie? And I think it's constantly evolving through external factors, whether it's cultural factors, whether it's factors which going back to the point Patrick said, with social factors like your peers. We're constantly challenging each other, especially as designers, to continue to evolve, to make things more functional, to make them visually more appealing, and to keep driving that aesthetic forward and moving it, whether we're using technology. And I think technology today is a huge factor in how we're driving aesthetics to a completely different dimension that before we would use quite traditional and primitive methods of designing and building, and now with technology and AI especially, that really can drive the aesthetics to possibilities that we never thought were possible in the past.
Yeah. Justine, why does beauty matter then? Because we often talk about purpose in design, but can something being beautiful not be a purpose in and of itself?
I think when we look at design, and we look particularly at making design more inclusive, making spatial design more inclusive, and putting people absolutely at the heart of the experience of design. Quite often we will go to the rules of perhaps contrast, for example, and visual acuity over actually something that's beautiful. And it seems sometimes that actually there's an elitism within design that actually makes access to beauty, to beautiful experiences, unattainable for the vast majority of people. And obviously they then have that choice of how they can work with it. Within colour, we have plenty of research that shows us similarly the way that we look at nature for structures, and we see beauty in mathematical relationships, that we see these similar relationships in colour. So your individual colour is not what matters. It's those relationships, and those are the relationships that we're instinctively hardwired to respond to. So I think it's that aspect of beauty should be for everybody to access in any way that they feel fit.
Well, let's get back to the crux of the question. Is beauty a dangerous word? I want to start with you, Penny, because being an academic, and of course, as Patrick pointed out, it's particularly dangerous, perhaps, in the realm of academia because it's difficult to qualify. But part of, I guess, why we pose this question is because beauty is sometimes seen as a pejorative. It's decorative, it's facile, it's superficial. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it's dangerous in that respect. I suppose we have the Bauhaus to blame for this, don't we? This idea that form follows function. Well, what the hell is function? Function can be what you want it to be. It can be practicality. It might be spiritual function. It might be sustainable function. It might be personal pleasure function. Function is a pretty broad word. So form follows function, for me, doesn't work at all. But nonetheless, in education, there is this sense that if you can kind of take that formula, form follows function, and justify your design, or is it either from the teacher's point of view or from the student's point of view, if you can justify it through structure, through materials, through engineering properties, or through its form as being sort of rational and geometric or whatever, then that's fine. You don't need to bring beauty into it. But of course, that what's not being said is that that's considered beautiful, but it's a kind of unsaid thing, isn't it? So the word doesn't come up.
I have a good friend who's a restaurant designer, and there was recently an article, not in our magazine, I should point out, we're not the ones who angered her, but there was a review in which they described the space as highly decorative. Now, I wouldn't consider that to be a particularly negative thing, but she was horrified because she felt that in a way it was a negative way of describing the space, that actually it was about function. There were layers of thought that had gone into it, and to use that word decorative was somehow a slight. What do you think about that, Patrick?
Well, I think that's a fallacy. So the modernist notion of ornament is prime, which in a sense kind of neutralized what I call the kind of semiological dimension of architecture. So I think ornament had a very important role to play. It's actually universal that everything is being decorated, including the self-decoration. Very, very strong in tribal societies. In later societies, it's more subtle, but it's always there. And otherwise, we need the kind of, let's say, it's a kind of communication system, even if it is evolved, like a language. No, it invented the language. It's a visual language which allows us to distinguish different types of people, establish groups, and in societies, which human society is always kind of much larger than a flock of primates. Where you need to gauge what's going on and who is in front of you, and so you need a lot of these articulations, and that is ornamenting the body, but also ornamenting the spaces and differentiating out the different functions and types of places. That's a universal and absolute necessity. You can't sweep that out. I would still argue that form follows function in the sense that this is social functionality, and the ornament is part of the form, and the system of form distinctions through ornament is also a form follows function, or better, there's a strong correlation, and form delivers function. And that's very important, and therefore I do reject, or I see the social functionality of ornament, I see the social functionality of appearances in general, which is also articulating something which becomes complex, make it more legible, easing of orientation, as well as signification, as I said. What I do reject is this idea that beauty is kind of lifted off and they kind of two opposite agendas. You have to decide whether you invest in beauty or you invest in functionality. That's a fallacy. Because what we should, if to the extent that they diverge, we running after false idols. And I don't agree with this idea. You have to, there's kind of this element of beyond practicality, just the thrill of beauty, and you should just cater for that. No, I don't think that's the case, because that's kind of then you making your life harder and in the end dysfunctional. So we need to work on the convergence of the let's say morphologies which deliver. We learn to love them and they become recognizable, so you can navigate better. And this is also for the designer, by the way. The designer, when he's designing and continuously critiquing and doodling and versioning, he will use aesthetic sensibilities because that's thinking fast. And at another time, you reflect back and you verify that your thinking fast intuitions have validity. But then no designer and no end user can breathe and work and live or efficiently design without aesthetic sensibilities, but they have to be the right ones. The ones which coincide the functionality with the functionality and not become a kind of separate project. That's the way we kind of draw at it.
And yet we do talk a lot about decorative lighting, for example. Do you think there's a little bit of snobbery sometimes in the design industries around what is classed as decorative?
Right. Well, I think with decorative lighting, I mean, it's a visual language, so you can have functional lighting, which, I always say as a designer, functional lighting should be invisible, it should be hidden, it should be about experiencing the space or making that space as functional as possible through lighting, whether it's ambient lighting, whether it's lighting for wayfinding. But decorative, I think, can bring in a different element where it can be a bit more tactile, it can give a bit more of a human connection, it can also connect into the visual language and interior style of the space, so it can add value not just from a functional perspective, but also from a visual perspective. So, for example, if we have a beautifully daylit space where you have lots of symmetry within the space, there's nothing nicer to punctuate or create gravity with a decorative pendant above the table or a point of reference in order to help guide people from A to B from a wayfinding perspective, and using a pendant as a tool in order not just to create illumination but also to have other factors can be quite a beautiful thing. It's also quite nice in regards to using symmetries by pairing of decorative wall lights within spaces in order to create a balance of a visual balance within a space. It's also a tool, I think, for designing a space and giving harmony to the other aesthetic elements within the space. And also creating these other extra layers of the light. So I quite like using decorative lighting where it merits it. And I think it's a really good way of designing a space where you can bring in these more softer material elements, in order to play up your design.
When we talk about beauty, though, it supposes that there's an opposite. Because if we can all agree that something is beautiful, we can all agree that something perhaps is ugly. So how do we decide on that? And maybe what are some of the cultural influences that have shaped our perception of what is and isn't beautiful?
Well, absolutely. We have, of course, the beautiful demands the ugly. This is discrimination, distinction, let's say. And not everything can be beautiful. Then if that would be the case, then the concept loses all its meaning. All concepts are actually distinctions, and therefore have a negative side. So definitely we have to learn to, pull away from that. And it's interesting that, of course, the reevaluation of our values, which aesthetic revolutions deliver, like the modernists, they thought that Rococo and Baroque, and particularly also the fake and the Neo Baroque, was grotesquely ugly. And compared this to the kind of tattoos of criminals. And I think there was some degree of truth and also some kind of fallacy was wiping out, let's say, the ornamental. So that will be, of course, there's ugliness and inappropriate use of things. And I think lighting for me is a very important dimension of design. And again, I would make the distinction decorative lighting versus functional lighting. We need to expand the notion of functionality to include that social functionality, that semiotic function of lighting that you calibrate the atmosphere, which brings people to the right mood for the right kind of event interactions you would like to have. And there's a strong kind of semiological atmospheric element in the lighting. And you can also, it's interesting, you can kind of modulate it. You can ease people from one part of the evening to another where it becomes more intimate and more, you break up the space more. And so functional light is not only the very kind of bright light where you can read your book, but this is also, this itself, although it functioning becomes indexical and becomes a signifier that you know that this space is where probably it's a workspace. And you can see that only by grasping the light. So everything becomes kind of signified. For that, you need to have it coherently aligned with the functionality, but it is not that technical functionality, which it is also social functionality. And lighting is, I'm talking about activism, object parameters, but also ambient parameters, light, shadow, and so on and so forth, and also observer parameters. So this is very important. And it's decoration, being decorative should never be a kind of castigation or dismissive. That is false snobbery. These snobs, they shoot themselves in their own foot.
Justine, I want to go back to this point about inclusivity, because I wonder if our perceptions of beauty are changing based on actually this idea of including more viewpoints. Because traditionally there was maybe a more select group of people that were the arbiters of what was and wasn't beautiful, and actually in an age of increasing inclusivity, we're allowing perhaps an appreciation for perspectives and viewpoints and styles that maybe otherwise have been underrepresented.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with Patrick that, as new design styles come along, they have to almost wipe out, destroy. That's the way you conquer, isn't it? Destroy what was there before. But actually, when you look at colour, I think the way that we understand ugly colour, again, is in this combination, is in this relationships. And when a relationship is out of sync, this is where we kind of start feeling uncomfortable, and so we may not appreciate it as beautiful. The other aspect as well, simply from a colour perspective, is the shifting, changing society that we live in. What's happening in the world? Obviously, it's dramatic things go on now, and you do see these huge shifts. Obviously, colour trends is something that's kind of pops up and moves along and is around sales. However, there is plenty of evidence to show that we have these kind of massive shifts. So they're kind of slow moving, but we will move from a type of colour. So it's not specific to any particular hue, but it's types of colour. And, if I think of decades, I think of them in colour terms of the types of colour. So, you think back to the avocado bathroom suite of the 70s, reviled through the ages until we get to now, and perhaps those emotional connections that we have make us reevaluate, make us appreciate that beauty. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. And as you mentioned, inclusivity, as we understand more and more about the way that people's preferences work, depending on our different diversities, the ways that our brains work. So, for example, there was a study a few years ago on boys from 7 to 15, I think, typically developing, and ASD, and they saw that actually there was active repulsion to yellow in the ASD group. So again, the way our brains work differently means that you respond in different ways.
So on that note of inclusivity, Penny, because of course you've written about going back to this idea of there being certain arbiters perhaps of taste, which is slightly different from beauty, but nonetheless they are groups that have shaped collectively, culturally, socially, what we consider to be beautiful. Are you seeing those barriers breaking down now? And is that part of what's precipitating perhaps a shift in what we do and do not consider to be beautiful?
Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? Just to pick up a couple of points from earlier, I think there's an argument that everything is beautiful to somebody. It's very hard to get away from the subjective, I think, and I don't know much about the hardwired side of it, but emotionally, I would argue that everybody has a different sense of beauty. However, there are collective senses of beauty, as we've talked about. I'm trying to think about what is, how near do you get to universal beauty? And I do think it's in nature. I think you have to get outside the man maybe to be able to understand something that perhaps we do understand as being beautiful. But then you think on the nature, the different aesthetic interpretations of nature, some of which are beautiful, some aren't. So you asked me about taste making, didn't you?
I'm just thinking, for example, historically, one might say that there was a class element So those that decided what was and was not beautiful were those that sat in a particular class spectrum, and therefore that was filtered down to everyone. Of course, that is perhaps not so much the case now, or maybe it is.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think I did mention at the beginning that, in sort of 18th century, aristocratic taste was considered with beautiful taste, and of course Kant was writing at that time, so there was a sort of notion of an absolute taste of beauty, got to call it that. But society has become much more complicated, as we've been saying, and I just don't think it's possible to impose taste on people anymore, because taste comes from above, but it comes from your side, it comes from below. And as you say, people will decide in a way. You might want to impose in a commercial sense, you might want to impose a certain aesthetic, but that might be rejected for whatever reason. So it is complicated. And I hate to use the term postmodernism because we don't talk about it anymore, but I think once that hit, we lost that sense of kind of a fixed order of things where beauty and taste were concerned.
Another designer friend once said to me that design is not art, and designers are not artists. Design is a solution to a problem, and for all intents and purposes, designers are technicians. What do we make of that?
Oh yeah, I think.
Whoever wants to go in, Patrick, what do you think?
First of all, I think it is not what we now recognize as contemporary art, in modern art, since modern art. There is a strong divergence. Older periods, there was this kind of phenomenon of contemporary art didn't exist, and you had artists being in total continuity with designers. And these works of art, whether they are in frescoes or sculptures, they were integrated with the building, and they had a particular purpose to fulfill, to make the building recognized, to edify and to educate. And that some of these aspects are now graphic designers and information designers, etc. And contemporary art is now kind of lifted off, particularly through photography. It was kind of running idle and then reinvented itself as something quite distinct. So I do make a strong distinction between contemporary art and contemporary design, because designers obviously also, they always work and compose and it's a color for real life, active, everyday life situations where these things in the end have to function, and there could be the wrong color scheme, and the colors become a distraction, a disturbance, rather than being kind of a framing that eases one into the situation. And contemporary art is something very different. And therefore we might, in the early experimental phase, dip into the art world and be inspired by it, but artists themselves is precisely being cut off from any functionality. If they have to fulfill purposes, that's already outside the art world. So we need to distinguish that. But of course, traditionally, art and architecture, this was the arts, and they were all highly pragmatically oriented. And this phenomenon of something kind of cut off from practicalities and being on kind of mostly provocative and brainstorming chamber for things to instrumentalize later, that's contemporary art. So that's why I'm emphasizing the distinction between art and architecture, art and design. All the design disciplines are one discourse. Art is something very different, contemporary art, and engineering is also another discipline.
Because I think at the heart of that statement is almost this idea that creativity isn't the basis of design, or in your perspective, shouldn't be. What do you think about that, Justine? Are you a color technician?
No. I think it's really interesting, actually, way back when, actually, science was part of that as well. And I'm a massive kind of biotech geek and have loved it for quite some time. And it's interesting how actually biotechnology, so we're looking at sciences and we're bringing those into how we build buildings, how we colour things, whether we are using bacterial dyes, and there's huge amounts of creativity. So I've always seen that there's a parallel between your what you would call an artist, whether they're working whichever medium, whether it's digital or physical, and designers as well, because also they're addressing similar issues, like the same issues are going on in the world and the same needs of people. And at the end of the day, the artists may be reflecting how they feel inside, but the designers are actually reflecting what's happening from the outside world. So there's this kind of meeting in the middle, I think.
So as tastes evolve, our notions of beauty evolves too. How does design have to adapt to keep up with that? How does it collect?
I think, well, it's quite interesting because if you think about taste and how that evolves, there's always like external factors that are influencing how that drives different trends. And like, I think, about lighting and how we apply light to space. Before it was very functional. If you think about lighting in the 60s, which is a great revolutionary time for objects and functionality of design, where circle back to those aesthetics and design quite a lot. But I think we think more in regards to human experience and how we experience buildings and how we experience space from a lighting perspective. Light sculpts a space internally, and we also think about what are the external environmental factors like daylight and how that also interacts with different spaces. So I think in regards to how we think about design or think about lighting and space and how we apply that into the built environment, it definitely comes from a more kind of psychological point, because we're thinking about how people feel in spaces and not just about the functionality. And I think that's driven because we know more, we understand more, we understand how people interact in space, and we've got lots of different ways of getting feedback loops. And I think it also, another influences, again, going back to technology, about how we design using different tools that allow us to push the boundaries of how we think about space and how we think about light, and how light itself has developed. If you think about, halogen versus where we are today with technology and LEDs, where we are manipulating color spectrums of light in order to influence how people see and experience. What are they in a retail environment, in different functional spaces? We're driving that visual element to a totally different level, where we're touching in people's emotions and driving how they interact with that space.
You talked about technology, and I'd love to stay with that. I don't know if anyone went to see Rafa Ganadol's exhibition at the Serpentine not long ago, but it was very interesting, and essentially explored this idea of there will be a new aesthetic, a new sense of beauty, a new sense of taste, because technology is going to shape what that looks like, particularly with the emergence of artificial intelligences. So what do we think about the role of technology and how that might shape what we do consider to be?
Well, I'm no longer a Marxist politically, but in terms of the so-called historical materialism, that the real driver of societal change is technology through productivity. And if a life process and an integration of technology delivers more degrees of prosperity with less work and more comfortable work, then this will have implications, and these implications also will change the physiognomy and morphology of our spaces and cities, and we need to kind of embrace that, and that's very important. And to some extent, we would hope you ask, do the design professionals and the design discourse, should they adapt to new tastes? Ideally, they should lead the taste evolution and adapt it and align it with the overall evolution of prosperity engines, which is driven through technology, but that doesn't often was achieved. So, for instance, that they came in to some extent. I was earlier talking about the modernists and the post-industrial revolution. Architects stayed kind of highly conservative for very, very long. And when finally the modernists came in, they had something to look at. They looked at aircraft, at ships, you find them in the factories, and realized there's something here, and we need to they aestheticized something, which of course was considered to be the ugly. And the cities didn't have these items. They were outside the city. So then they turned this around and revolutionized and then run with it. So these are these retrospective manifestos. And similarly, when modernism had been going on for decades, there was also the real impetus came from outside. You have this kind of clean satellite cities which emerged. They became dysfunctional for this kind of new development of a network society, micro-literary revolution. And then suddenly some people, these kind of cluster cities which weren't all planned. The chaos of Tokyo was loved, and this kind of old new stuff integrating with the old was loved, and you had things like ad hocism. So these were a kind of a collage city. Again, the aestheticization of what was breaking forth and showing what was the vitality, where's vitality and how does it look like, and then aestheticizing it, and then writing the retrospective manifesto, for instance, like Delirious New York, whereas Le Corbusier would have had rejected Manhattan and what it became. So that's, ideally we would be the leaders at Charlton, but oftentimes we are not up for the game. But some of us belatedly then kind of realize that we have to, evolve tastes. And the general public also doesn't, do that. We all late. But I think we should expect for the disciplines and the project designers to be a bit less late than everybody else.
We'll shortly open up for some audience questions, so put your thinking hats on. But before we do, Justine, technology, what do we think its role will be in perhaps determining the aesthetics of the future?
I think technology is quite exciting, actually, because it opens new opportunities to us. So that's something that's really important. When you look back at the colour industry and the dyeing process, some of the dyes, so you may associate purple with royalty, simply down to the fact that thousands and thousands of poorly deceased nails were needed to make one very small piece. And when that revolution came of an accident while trying to make quinine, and the dawn of chemical dyeing, it opened up this whole new aesthetic, this whole new opportunity of colours that we could achieve, things that we could use. And, I've touched on bacterial dyeing now, but you see the opportunities presented within structural colour and how we as humans were so attracted to shimmer and glimmer, and we love it. However, ethically, it's not a good place to be. And so I think that kind of shapes our aesthetic. But there are opportunities now where we can do that in very much an organic way, and we can still achieve.
I think it's a fantastic point about how values also have to shape what we allow ourselves to consider useful. There was something I was reading recently about most very brightly coloured fabrics have to be produced that way using toxic dyes.
Even denim is the worst.
Yeah.
Even organic denim.
That with sustainability, we actually might have to force ourselves to become more enamored with more muted colours because it's going to be the more sustainable choice, and at that point we have to choose values over.
Or understanding the beauty in change as well. So within the colour industry, obviously universality, consistency have been absolute key drivers in manufacturing, but we need to shift that aesthetic beauty, idea of beauty as consumers, that we will accept things that are changeable. You just reframe it as unique.
That. Do we have any questions? Yeah. Better.
Like you mentioned, with the advent of AI, sometimes we associate what's beautiful with the fact that it was created from an original standpoint and from a creative standpoint. And with AI having the ability to create and spend competing thus to come up with something original, is it possible that beauty would become common and the idea of beauty would become mediocre?
But I don't think mediocrity is the right concept. I mean, beauty should be adapted. Our values should be adapted to what's beneficial. And so you asked me about the future also, and I don't know about the future requirements, but I do know that technology drives contemporary tasks and solutions, and we need to jump on the solutions and address these tasks. And so far, the aesthetic revolution we are promoting is way not arrived. So we have to first kind of conquer the present before we talk about the future. But AI is just a fantastic tool which allows us to do more of that. And the fact that this is generated from a certain process shouldn't mean that it has some inherent mediocrity or it's just empowering. I don't see anything kind of problematic.
Nice point, though, that perhaps Ducey is also.
But you mentioned up there that somebody thinks that the Google guy was talking about, and I wasn't here yesterday, that we could have AI systems recognizing and be embedding aesthetic values and help somebody who's just learning what they should learn to love. It could be a great help, and I believe that's possible. And he was talking about emotional intelligence, and that's just kind of doesn't mean that the system has emotions, but that it kind of delivers intuitive, quick, the style in which you will recognize as aesthetic decisions. So, and again, no problem here.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
My question is mainly to Mr. Patrick. I remember we were attending one of our lectures in Bartha School of Architecture, is History and Theory of Architectural Design. And I remember in one of our lectures that I will never forget, it was a brilliant idea that you suggested about the way you think of design. So in traditional architectural education, we think always that form follows function. And I think it was you were promoting the idea of thinking exactly the reverse of this. So you mentioned theoretically, in current modernism architecture, we're all living in quadratic spaces, and our parents did, and our grandparents did. So that's why we're used to this, and this is what our idea of home and love and is associated with. But theoretically, if let's say a child would grow up in a more parametric space, which our ancestors lived in case, their idea of beauty would be, their idea of what beauty and norm would be that would be their like aesthetic function. So my question is like, would you expand on this idea of how we can, we can dictate the function by designing first?
Well, I mean, probably what I meant is, in the end, I do think that forms need to serve the functions which have to do with, ultimately, I think, material freedom and to make life easier and quick and not wasting time by being disoriented, running down wrong corridors, the things not being properly connected, we can't recognize what's going on, the disempowered. So it's about empowering life. So that means form follows function. But in the, let's say, design research process in academia, the way we teach, for instance, at DAA, we reverse this because we are developing, in order to fulfill new functions with new forms, you have to kind of come up with new forms. And that can be separated out in a division of later. So restarting from form to function, we're generating new formal possibilities and systems which come out of new design technologies. And there is this kind of new, but then we also say we don't just play with forms, we want to then see what we can use these for. So we then find functions and utilities for these forms. And then you have build up these correlations, and then you then ask to design something where the function is given. That's a normal condition. Then you have something you could never have had if you straight go to the function and then think, I have to derive the form out of this. That's first of all difficult, and you can only rely on what your formal repertoire. And to expand the repertoire, you need what I call formal research and expand the formal problem-solving repertoire. Now, it's a formal problem-solving repertoire because the only means we have as designers to solve problems is forms. But in the end, we have to, so in the kind of design research in the avant-garde stages, we are very much focusing on form. That's why somebody here to my farm started, a student on me said, he was the only one raising his hand when he said, being privileged for form or function. It's form. In the academic, in the research, yes, but finally not. And you said, you might be socialized into a certain environment, and that becomes what you expect, that you love. And that's great. If these environments and the morphologies you're used to, and they are well adapted to your purposes, if they're still later in life, if society and conditions are stable enough, you can rely on this. But if you've grown up in a village and you've learned certain things and you come to the big city and you're thrown into, and all of it is for you kind of menacing and ugly, and then you pull back, then you have problems because you're not adapted. So you're socialized into something where you pull yourself away from what you should love and where you could flourish. So that's the thing. We have to always think together that these aesthetic values need to help us identify what's good for us and for society.
And yet, the colour theory actually almost disproves this idea that what we appreciate in design is all socialized. Because as much as there are, of course, cultural influences, there are also commonalities that we see globally, irrespective of culture. Someone could be in a rainforest in Brazil or in the heart of Tokyo, and yet we know, for example, that blue is the most popular culture. Anyway.
Most popular colour in the world, regardless of age, sex, culture, doesn't really matter. Blue, but you think of blue, all of you think of a blue in your mind, and they're all going to be entirely different. So your blue is not my blue at all, and they're going to be very different. But I think it's interesting, Patrick, you're always talking about inviting people in and creating forms that invite people in. And I think that's very much the same with colour. Obviously, there was a study 4 years ago that it was quite a big study, 10,000 people across 73 nations speaking 38 languages, and they found 87.6% correlation between colour and emotion. So there is a basis there, I would say, but it's how you then layer it up into that kind of symbolism and how you, again, experience through various different neurodiversities. Again, colour is something, you talk about how you experiment with form and how you research with form. Colour has so much potential to offer us. Again, it's one of those simplest things in your toolkit that at the moment I personally feel has been underutilised within the built environment, and people unfortunately think that when we talk about colour, we are just talking about me in my jazzy red trousers. That was deliberate for a talk this morning. But however, colour is so many different levels and on so many. It's fundamental to our understanding of the world, basically.
We are sadly out of time. You might be able to grab them afterwards if you do have any last questions. But for now, please join me in saying a huge thank you to our RFCAN.